Welcome to the Maintainable Software podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Robin Heinze, who is currently the Director of Engineering at Infinite Red and is a co-host of the React Native Radio podcast. Robin joins us from the greater Portland, Oregon area in the United States, not too far from where I reside. Robin Heinze, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, Robin. So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
So I really love crowdsourcing this kind of thing to my team and just to see where they're all at. So I asked them and I got a whole array of answers, but they really boiled down to kind of two lenses. One being software where you're seeing a lot of people coming in to different people coming in to maintain it. So open source primarily. And there you're looking for really robust setup scripts, documentation, making it easy for people to jump in and figure out what's going on, basically, as well as a really clear stated purpose and goal for the project. Like what is this project trying to accomplish? What are its goals? And a really good elevator pitch. My CIO, Gant Laborde, he said he really loves to include some sort of graphic or GIF or something in a project that just really grabs people and sells the product or the project. And that's just to help people kind of get context, why they're making the changes that they're making and make sure that they're aligned with the project's goal. So that's open source. But then there's the code itself and what makes for easily maintainable code. And there was a lot of the answers that you'd expect, like really good CI, really good tests, really good documentation, the usual suspects. But then some deeper answers, always, if you're a developer, always be refactoring, constantly cleaning up behind you as you go. Kind of, if you see it, say something. It's like the announcement they have on the metro or whatever it is. If you see something, say something. If you see something, fix something. And that just helps keep things clean kind of always, instead of letting the tech debt pile up. So tons of different ideas. There's not, I don't think, a silver bullet for what makes maintainable software. There's kind of a lot of things.
I appreciate you crowdsourcing your team and getting their input. Is it a safe assumption that there were almost as many different answers to that as there were team members that were part of that answer?
Everybody had a different perspective and a slightly different answer.
Who is the see something, say something? Because I think maybe I have a weird association with that. I just remember when that became much more prevalent in our communities, it felt like under a surveillance kind of culture in a way. Maybe if you see something I always kind of associate it as a surveillance, keeping an eye on your
report,
neighbors
report to the boss if you see
in DARE class, tell on your parents if they're smoking marijuana or something. Anyway, So I understand that probably not what your team was probably advocating for, or maybe, I don't know. But so when you think about that, the see something, say something thing, where do you get into that scenario from see something, say something to then maybe the important part is probably to address it, to do something? How do you approach that yourself, or how do you kind of coach your team through that?
I think in general, if it's small things like cleaning up types or fixing formatting or whatever it may be, if it's small enough, I'm all for just bundle it in with your work. It'll get reviewed in your PR. Totally fine. Bigger things, I think see something, say something is going to mean at least capture it in a story, put it on the list, so that it's not just going to get forgotten again. But in general, I'm if it's a quick little thing and there's not really a danger of it introducing regressions or bugs or anything by just shoving it in with your other work, then do it. I'm all for it.
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's gotta be music to your budget's ears. Plus, they're certified ISO 27001, and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. Speaking back to the open source, what's the word I'm looking for all of a sudden? Characteristics of like well-maintained software, or things that you think about or your team thinks about when they're looking at maybe an open source project, and things that they're doing to help acclimate new people to the project. You mentioned like in particular that your coworker or colleague likes to include like a graphic or a GIF or something. Like, can you think of like off the top of your head, like what might be useful there, like a visual there? Without looking up something in my browser right now, I'm just curious if you can kind of speak to that a little bit.
So a good example would be like, I'm a mobile developer. And so a lot of the libraries that I'm using are like UI components.
Oh, okay.
So if there's like a photo selector or a carousel or something, like have a couple GIFs that like show it in action,
Yes.
sort of demonstrate the like what it does, goes a long way in terms of getting people to use it, like choose it for their software, and B, getting people to contribute to it.
Okay, so kind of like a screenshot in a similar way, like on my Z Shell project, I have like screenshots of like themes and things like that. So you know what it's going to look at before you do it, or if like a CLI type of thing, you can put a screenshot or
it's like a visual product spec, like this is what it's supposed to do.
No, that's helpful. I think in that context, I think I end up working a lot more in like back-end web applications. And so there's often less, it's like you're working on a library and it's like, well, this can integrate with an API. And there's not, I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of like, what would a graphic do there outside of just being like, you're going to write some code, or here's it's like sample code or something, something you might include. Or something.
Either way, with something like that, which is less visual, the more like examples or like things like that you can include in the documentation.
What's your current take on the metaphor technical debt? Do you talk about it? Do you feel like your definition of it in your head has evolved over the years? And
we have an interesting perspective, being we're a consultancy. So we're doing work for clients. So in some ways, like, we're not the owners of technical debt in the same way that we would be if it was our own product. But we also have the unique position of having to convince clients to pay us to clean up tech debt that we created, which is interesting. But also, a lot of times it will honestly come down to us explaining to a client, like, oh, you want X, Y, Z features by this date, and it's really important that you get them out by this date. Well, okay, here are the trade-offs. We're going to incur this set of technical debt in order to do that on the timeline that you want. And it's really a matter of being very upfront with them about trade-offs and costs, and also benefits. Like, I have a client right now, and we really need to swap out the navigation library that we're using in their app. But it's our job as the consultants to explain to them how doing this essentially technical debt work will benefit them and ultimately make their app better, more user-friendly, more performant, whatever. And so that's part of our job, is to explain to them why it's necessary or beneficial to address tech debt.
That's interesting. And I want to dig into the client part of this a little bit with you. Before that, though, just to give our audience a little bit of a quick one-on-one on like what your company does. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what Infinite Red is and what you do there, what type of work you do there.
We are a software development agency that specializes in React Native. So if you're not familiar, React Native is a cross-platform library that lets you develop iOS and Android primarily, but also many other platforms, including web, tvOS, like et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of the deal is you write once and you run anywhere is a very simplified slogan. But yeah, so we build React Native apps for clients.
And are you typically spinning up new apps and handing them over to your clients, or do you more often come into an existing code base and help them with that, or is it kind of 50-50-ish?
It's really all over the board. Primarily, we are creating new React Native apps, sometimes from complete scratch, but other times they are replacing existing iOS and Android native apps. So like combining essentially two full teams into one React Native team to build one React Native app. Yeah.
And is that typically when a company or organization is going through that process to make that decision, do you have an understanding that a big part of that is just to consolidate like the team size on their end? Is that like a goal for them, or maybe they think they can do more with a smaller team if they're using a cross-platform solution like that?
It's a great question. Yes. So the teams that we've done this with, primarily their goals are to reduce the necessary team size and just increase the speed that they can iterate as a result. And then another key benefit is that it broadens the developers that they can bring in to work on the project. All of a sudden, you've opened the door to React.js developers, JavaScript developers in general. Your web team is now capable of building your mobile app. So it really broadens who can maintain your app while also reducing the number of people that need to.
That's interesting. And I also imagine, I mean, I don't work too closely with too many different like native app building teams, but I would imagine that if like you are working in a scenario where you got your team working on maybe a small team, large teams, whatever, working on your iOS app and your Android app, trying to keep some sense of like feature parity in parallel, getting deployed to both environments, I would imagine would be difficult, knowing that there's different approval processes. I mean, maybe that's still difficult in some ways, but I would imagine that's probably another benefit of something like React Native and other similar types of tools.
Yes, absolutely. It is honestly one of the biggest goals that for the teams that do this, and that you can also include web in that group. It's much easier to have feature parity with web and Android and iOS because they can share, like you can share components. Like you can literally share code between the three platforms. So it's seen as a huge benefit to a lot of teams for maintainability.
And is Infinite Red often your team coming into those scenarios and helping like speed up that process for the team to kind of, if they're new to it, like, hey, we want to make this transition. Like, can you help point us in the right direction, help put together some initial building blocks, and then we can kind of continue down this path and reach out to you if we need some more advice?
Yeah, absolutely. That's generally our role, is being the React Native experts. While often you're talking about Objective-C and Kotlin or Java developers being told they need to learn React Native. So we'll come in as the React Native experts, but then maintain their team as the native experts, because React Native has there's the JavaScript side and then there's the native side, and you kind of have to coordinate them both and know about them both. So we'll take the native expertise from their team and then our React Native expertise and kind of marry them.
In preparing for our conversation, I know that your team had worked on a top 10 App Store app, which got rewritten in React Native. So what kind of, was there anything outside of what we already talked about that kind of led to the decision to do a rewrite? Maybe you can tell us a little about like the process that your team kind of went through. Is that something you can iteratively do, or did it need to be kind of like a full swap over at some big point?
It generally has to be a swap over. Yeah. But the benefit is that we were able to take a lot of the native code from the existing app and reuse it in a sort of React Native environment. But it had quite a few, it was a legacy code base. It had quite a few rough edges and demons lurking. So we had our work cut out for us. There was one particular and like really thorny instance with a memory leak in their like advertisement like library, and one of our devs ended up just old school debugging it, like comment out this block and comment like just like isolate parts of the code. But it ended up being an issue in a third-party library, which is so common. And we reach for one of the tools that we use all the time, which is Patch Package, which lets you basically own your dependencies without having to wait for a OSS maintainer to finally get around to whatever the bug is and do a pull request. You can just like patch the
Oh, interesting.
dependency directly. And we do that all the time as a way of like taking control of our dependencies and sort of owning that.
So in that scenario, I mean, without knowing enough about that particular code and how the package or the software that gets pushed out to the apps gets deployed, is that the sort of thing where you're still referencing the original library? Does the things get pulled from external source, or do you load them in and they all get packaged like locally on your local code environment, and then a package is developed or pushed out, or some maybe in your CI, those all packages. So is it still referencing the third or the open source
Mhm.
project, or do you just have like a complete, kind of air quoting fork of it that you're now maintaining?
No, it actually, so it's basically like a git diff, and then it pulls in the package like normal from npm and then literally applies a
Oh,
diff like git
interesting.
would. So you make your changes and then you say patch this and it figures out the diff and then it just applies that diff every time it installs the package. It's really cool, really useful, especially if you're trying to sort of maintain, if you don't have the ability to upgrade a dependency because it's locked for whatever reason, you're just tied into it. You can just update it yourself and keep ownership of it, basically.
Interesting. That was a
Yeah.
patch packer.
Patch package. Yeah.
Pack.
I don't know if it's like tied to a specific, if it's just JavaScript or if it's like, we love
We'll
it.
include links to that in the show notes for people.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about that. So one of the other topics I wanted to speak with you, because you do work at a consultancy, as do
Mhm.
I. So you work at Infinite Red and I work at Planet Argon, and we work in the client services world. And that's
Mhm.
a little different than maybe a lot of people listening, what their experience is like if they work at like a product company or a company that has their own internal software projects that they're working on. And so we work on a variety of different clients with a lot of different people and a lot of different code bases. So
Yes.
I'm kind of curious, one, as in your role with your engineering team, do you feel like there's certain traits that you look for in the people that you are going to recruit and hire for your team that may not be necessary, or maybe a little less necessary if they were to say work at a product company?
I would say the ability to be flexible is extremely important when working as a consultant because clients are going to client and they all have their own agendas and priorities, and one client is going to not be the same as the next client, and you have to be adaptable and flexible. I think also a good trait or a trait of a good consultant is being able to sort of take in things that happen that maybe like super stressful or like worrying or panic inducing to a product company and like just take them in really rationally and logically and like lay out solutions and sort of address them without getting too like stressed out or worked up.
Mm,
Because what a client wants is for you to be sort of confident and strong, and they want to have confidence in you. So it's important to be able to like respond to things really calmly and logically, and in my experience.
We'll be back with our interview with Robin in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you. Yes, you listener, you're fabulous. You are amazing. You're delightful. And you're listening to the podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, please tell some people about it. You can do that by, I don't know, telling people about it. I think you know how to do that. Drop a link in the email. Do you subscribe to the newsletter? You should check that out. If you go to maintainable.fm and you can subscribe to the newsletter, you can find it there. I think you can find it. You're smart. You're a smart, savvy person. You got this far. I believe in you. And now let's get back to our interview with Robin Heinze. I agree with that. And I also wonder how, someone that employs, engineers that in a consultancy, it's an interesting thing. I'm like, it's hard for me to articulate or to help train people maybe to build up that confidence
Mm-hmm.
in those scenarios. If they're a couple of years into their career in general, and they maybe may or may not have worked at a product company before.
Yeah.
or at a consultancy before. And so to go into those situations where the clients are kind of looking for guidance,
Yeah.
advice, some confidence, and to be a neutral third party to some degree at times, what sort of like, how do you think about that yourself, and like what sort of advice might you offer to like a junior or mid-level person that's kind of like navigating that sort of thing?
I mean, it does come down to just experience and doing it enough times that you've seen whole projects through, and you can kind of see like, okay, I've been in this situation before. I've been in this situation before. And this is how like it turns out fine, and you can stay a lot more level-headed because you've seen through experience that it'll be okay, and like you'll figure it out. And one of the things that we do to kind of help those newer devs, even just new to consulting,
Mm.
honestly, is we have, I'm going to call it a buddy system. We don't actually call it that. We call it, so each project has a primary and a secondary. And the primary is the one who's kind of leading the project, interfacing with the client, and sort of keeping the overall goals of the project in mind when making day-to-day decisions. And then the secondary is mostly just doing tasks like building features, doing stories. But if we have someone who's newer to consulting, they'll be in a secondary role for quite a while a primary who's been on a few projects can take the lead. And then after someone has been on a few projects and they kind of get the hang of it, then we start upgrading them to primary. But we'll never put someone who's new to development or new to consulting on a project alone. Like you'll always have someone who's done the ropes before.
That makes sense. And I like the, do you explicitly say primary and secondary as part of the terminology internally?
Yes.
Is
Yeah.
there tertiary or anything else beyond that?
No, it's
Okay.
it's your primary and secondaries. So
Okay.
everyone who's not a primary is a secondary.
I see. And okay. And so they're not like second in charge, or like
No,
they're like,
the hierarchy ends there.
okay, 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 that makes sense. It's an interesting thing. And like when I've had conversations with developers, and like we're in, even people that are maybe in a, say, primary role and they've been around for several years, there's still an interesting thing when they hit those kind of like conflict points where they've not specifically dealt with this particular scenario before. Or like,
Hmm.
well, this is a very unique situation. Like, how do we navigate this? And I'm like, we've never used that tool before. We've not, and it's like, well, that we figure things out eventually, right? So it's just like, how
Yeah,
do you convey a certain level of like confidence that you can say, we've not actually had an experience with that yet, but we'll
we'll
figure it out.
figure it out.
We've worked on
Yeah.
some similar things, and I've read some articles about that. So I'm actually really excited and curious to learn about that. And I think there's a way
Yes.
to talk about that with the client, that the client's like, great, you're going to solve the problem for us, not that they're expecting to just be able to like off. Because another part of the consulting part, or when they're engaging with us, is like we're trying to help them get somewhere faster than they could on their own. And so part of
Hmm.
that is just doing the work on their behalf, or learning the things and then showing them what you learned through the process. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be this like scenario where you need to come across like everything going into it. They're just like, can you figure this out for me? They might say, they
Yeah.
might be asking, can you build this for me? But what they're really saying
Right.
is, can you figure out how to get this thing built? Yeah.
I always tell my team we market ourselves as the React Native experts, but you personally don't have to be an expert. Like we have this, I don't even know that we have a name for it, but we do this thing where you always replace the word I with the word we. You don't have to say yes, I can do that. You can say yes, we can do that, because you have confidence that your team of 20 engineers who aren't on your project but are on your team will figure this out together. Like you can always say we can do that. We will figure that out, and know that your team is behind you to support you. We have this internal motto, don't do hard things alone. So anytime something like that comes up on a client, like you're not going to have to do it alone. The client doesn't even have to know how much pairing or whatever you're doing behind the scenes. Like they just need to know that you're going to get it done.
It's all about
Um,
optics.
yeah, exactly.
And I'm also curious, when you're coming into scenarios where you're working on your client's code bases, do you have thoughts, or do you talk about this amongst your team on how to be a good guest in another organization's code base?
It's an interesting question. I don't know that we talk about it explicitly because half 50, like it's probably 50-50, whether it's a code base that, although it's owned by our client, we created it, in which case we're following our own processes and
Okay.
standards and everything. But the other half of the time we are working in someone else's code. And it's a really fine balance between bringing our standards to the table and like sharing our best practices. Because a lot of times we maybe know the best practices about React Native better than they do if they're new to it and we're coming in as experts. So it's a balance between respecting their sort of processes and procedures and everything versus bringing in our expertise and sharing that our best practices. But in general, if they have PR processes and stuff, we follow them. We sort of adapt and assimilate a little bit. But we also kind of teach the team to be a little bit firm when it comes to code standards and things like that. If the things that they're asking us to do are lower than our standards, basically.
That's good advice for your team, I think, to think through. And do you often ever do anything sort of like a team or staff augmentation type work?
We specifically try to avoid what we call staff augmentation. We use that term, we reference that term a lot in what we don't do, primarily because we want them to see us as consultants and not as place fillers, basically. So what they're paying for is not just seats, they're paying for our expertise as a team. And also, it's really important to us that our people feel like they work for Infinite Red and don't feel like they work for the client, because it can be a completely different work experience. And they didn't sign up to work for XYZ, a huge corporation. They just signed up to work for Infinite Red with our culture and everything. So it's really important to us that people feel like they're working for us.
I can appreciate that. We occasionally do it, and it's always sometimes I think like, oh, I don't think our team actually wants to do that type of work because they joined Planet Oregon because they want to be part of our team and part of our culture and work on our projects. And when we do these types of maybe kind of one-off team type augmentation type scenarios, we always have to think about like, okay, how is our team going to, one of our team members going to get embedded in their team? How do they think about being a good guest and, they're there? How do we communicate? How do we want to help improve that team? And I think when we think about it, like we're doing this right now with one client and we're constantly thinking like, well, we're hoping that person will go in and kind of plant some seeds that might generate more work for us in the future. Like, oh, let me bring some of my coworkers into the situation.
Like a little mole, a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. And it's like, well, we just need one person right now, but we're like, all right, let's just see if we can infect this company. And I'm trying to be creative as a business person and think about different ways we can help it. Because we know that the client doesn't want to hire a bunch of people themselves, and we think we can do a lot of stuff for them, but baby step our way there.
I will say if we do, I mean, there are times when, the schedule is maybe a little sparse and you take what you could get, basically, and we'll end up in a staff aug position. But we have a rule that we won't place anybody alone in those types of projects, just so that it's a buddy system thing again. Like it's easier to hold boundaries and sort of advocate if you've got a friend. True. Yeah.
Let's take a moment to plug your podcast that you're a co-host of. Yeah, React Native Radio.
Yeah, so I am a co-host of React Native Radio, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's our podcast. It comes out roughly weekly. Yeah, that's the goal. It's about everything React Native. Check it out. reactnativeradio.com.
I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes. I'm curious, as for you on maybe a professional development level, how do you feel like participating in podcasts? For how many years now have you been a part of it? And how has that changed how you think about your day-to-day work?
It's honestly been huge for me. I've been doing it since, 2020. It's been probably 3 or 4 years. And it completely changed my professional life. Just in terms of subject matter, being a subject matter expert, it sort of forced me to deep dive into a lot of different things that I wouldn't have otherwise deep dived into, as well as the number of people that I've met from the industry who've come on as guests, as well as just overall confidence, which has helped me just in terms of general life skills, but also client communications and things like that. My overall confidence is much, much higher. So it's been a huge boon.
Hey again, it's me, Robby. Just wanted to take a quick moment to plug my own company, Planet Argon. We help companies with existing Ruby on Rails applications make them better and more maintainable. That's right, we're in the business of helping modernize Ruby on Rails applications. If you're working on a much older version of Ruby on Rails and need some help and guidance on how to get to use the new features and new functionality coming out in the next version of Ruby on Rails, we're happy to help point you in the right direction. Get in touch with us at planetargon.com. Again, planetargon.com, and tell me that I sent you. Let me know that you listened to the podcast. And with that, let's get back to our interview with Robin Heinze. That's awesome. For me, secretly, why I do this podcast is so that I get an opportunity to talk shop with a bunch of people like you. And I get to learn a little bit about how different, I sneak in, I'm like, how does Infinite Red do things? I could probably just send you an email and you might answer questions, but I'm like, let's do it publicly. And then it makes it harder for you to skip a question. But do you find that, you mentioned like getting into maybe diving a little bit deeper into certain topics or doing more research on things. How do you think about, like my podcast is like more just information or interview style. And so there's a kind of a similar-ish format. But if you're talking about like some new things coming up in like React Native, I assume there's more of that sort of like topical, what's coming down the pipeline type of thing, or look excited about some new thing or talking about a library. How do you think about topics, or what's your process look like for that?
So there's three of us that host, and we'll meet weekly to prep for the episode that's coming up, but we'll also take a chance to kind of brainstorm topics. But it's also somewhat organic. Like Jamin, our CTO, is extremely active on Twitter. I will not call it X. It's still Twitter in my head.
I feel like everybody that's mentioned it on the podcast says the same thing.
But he's extremely active on Twitter, has a huge network, loves to talk to people. And he'll talk to someone and someone will jump in and he'll say, oh, hey, do you want to be on the podcast to talk about this? And it'll happen very organically like that. And then we'll get them scheduled. But so we kind of alternate between having guests that have come about through conversations like that versus just straight topics where it's just the three of us sort of having a discussion about a topic. Usually it's just it'll be really topical, like a new library or an upcoming release of React Native, or we have this new series recently, R&R Explains, where we just pick like little facet of React Native that's not new or like anything, but that maybe people probably haven't read that specific part of the docs ever, and kind of do a deep dive on that really small sliver. So we do stuff like that. We're constantly digging around to figure out new topics. After 4 years, it gets harder. All the low-hanging fruit is gone, but then you get to come back around too. You get to say, well, we did it 4 years ago. It's been long enough. We could probably do it again. So you get to
makes sense.
Reuse topics.
One of the things that I wouldn't say dislike, but one of the downsides to this format of interacting with, and sharing content is that it's not conducive to a lot of replies and comments necessarily, because, people just because of the way the content gets distributed,
right. There's no comments on podcasts.
No. And so there are in some weird little places, like I've realized you can find occasionally like a little comment somewhere, like on a Spotify thing. And you're like, how would I have got a notification? So it's just like, you see these little things pop up in weird places and I'm like, okay. So how does your team think about like community building? Have you done more branched out in certain ways to foster community? Do you sort of events that you might like be organizing, or things where people that are listening to the podcast or something like can come together? Or how do you kind of approach that?
Communities is huge for us. We're always like trying to find ways to bring specifically the community that we see as like our audience together. We have a Slack community that gets quite a lot of engagement. There's a whole like React Native radio channel in there. And then Twitter is a huge avenue, but it's difficult with, like you said, there's no comments on it's not like YouTube, although we have started doing YouTube versions of the podcast, which may increase engagement. We'll see. It's new.
Do you do video with your podcast or just audio?
We've done one episode with video. We're just starting. Historically, we haven't. And so it's been hard to reach our audience. We've relied on like, hey, like plugging our Twitter at the end of every episode, like, hey, hit us up on Twitter. Like we get DMs occasionally with people giving feedback, or we'll put out polls, casual polls, but like, hey, what topics do you want to see? We've done that a couple times.
And as far as events, I believe Infinite Red helps
Right.
organize it. Is it an annual thing?
Yes. So we put it on an annual conference for React Native called Chain React. It's in the Portland area. This year it's July 17th through the 19th. I'm not sure when this episode's coming out and if there'll be time left for people to come, but if you hear this and there's enough time, come see us in Portland on July 17th. chainreactconf.com.
Do those talks get video recorded and published at some point?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we do record them with Confreaks and they'll be on our
Ah,
YouTube after the fact.
and are you speaking there this year?
I am
No.
actually, yeah. I'll be speaking, talking about our open source React Native boilerplate called Ignite. So I'll be talking about that. This is my first conference talk, so I'm
Oh,
excited.
well, congratulations. Or I want to say congratulations. Also maybe good luck
Good
with
luck.
the emotional and psychological roller coaster that you are probably already
Uh,
on.
yeah, I'm in the initial preparations of just getting my talk outline, so it's not real quite yet that I'm actually gonna have to get on stage and talk to people.
Yeah. What I have a couple of talks coming up myself, and I got invited to speak at a conference in Berlin. And I thought it was going to be initially a Q&A session to talk about Oh My Z Shell, and then they asked me if I could just do a talk instead. And I was like,
Like, oh.
oh, wait. Oh, that's a much more what am I going to talk about? Okay. I'm like, there's definitely things I could talk about, but I'm like, I don't want
I
to
I don't know. A talk sounds better to me than a Q and A because
do.
I can prepare my talk and know exactly how it's gonna go.
Well, you can also show up to a client meeting and talk your way through it, or I'm not gonna
Uh-huh.
say BS your way through it, but like I can hop on a call with anyone and start like answering questions.
Yeah.
Maybe not be the best. I could at least tell a story or two.
You don't
So
have to do any work ahead of time.
no, that's true. But I think it is a certain level of like knowing that you need to hold the audience's attention and
Hmm.
take them on a worthwhile adventure, I suppose, with their attention. So I actually hired a professional public speaking coach to do one-on-one training with me over the
Oh, there you
next.
go.
So I have my first session with her on in a couple of days, and
Oh, wow. Cool, cool.
so
Look.
that's me trying to level up a little bit more. And so we'll see how this. I'll report back on if that was a
Well,
worthwhile.
I will say Gant Laborde, who I mentioned previously, is also he's like a I don't know if you know what Toastmasters is.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, but he's achieved like the highest ranking that you can possibly achieve in Toastmasters
Mm.
and is the closest thing to a public speaking like wizard
Oh wow,
that so luckily I have him on my side helping me get prepared. So
that's awesome.
I'm not super worried.
Well, maybe I'll send him an email and ask for some advice too. All right, I have a couple of quick last questions for you, Robin. Is there a non-software, non-programming, non-tech book that you might recommend to people on your team or colleagues that you meet and be like, I think this will help you?
It depends on like how broad your definition is of help. I'm not a huge self-help book person. I'm a fiction. Like if I'm reading for enjoyment. So if helping is
Well, I mean
getting
that
them some time to relax and unwind, I have to recommend this mystery series that I just started that is just absolutely fantastic. The first one's called The Thursday Murder Club,
hmm.
and it's about
It is
a
actually
group of
this is recorded on a Thursday too.
oh, perfect. It's the Thursday Podcast Club.
Okay.
It's about a bunch of octogenarians in a retirement village that solve murders. It's so charming and delightful, and I highly recommend.
Nice. I'll include links to that in the show notes for our listeners. There was another thing I wanted to quickly ask you was when it comes to, you're working on in a consulting capacity, does your team often get asked by maybe your clients or maybe you think about this, are there some types of data metrics that when it comes to like in the mobile app development space, are there some metrics that your team kind of keeps an eye on that kind of tracks how healthy the software delivery cycle is right now?
In general, you keep an eye on things like App Store reviews, downloads, experience metrics like crashes and things like that. You want to keep those as low as possible. But generally, if you could get people to leave reviews that are good, that's a good indication that things are going well.
And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering online?
You can find me on Twitter at Robin underscore Heinze with an E at the end. There's somebody that's squatting on my name without the underscore.
Oh,
They're on my list.
excellent. I'll
Uh,
include links to that for in the show notes for everybody, and also to your podcast and such, so people
Perfect.
can start following that if that's of interest to them. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Robin. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop.
Thank you so much for having me.